Guðjónsson and Mackeith, 1990, a proven case of false confession, psychological aspects of the coerced compliant type. Background. This is the third study we'll be looking at, from interviewing suspects, making a case, and it's further categorised into false confession. Guðjónsson and Mackeith, 1990, is a case study about a 17-year-old boy who confessed to a crime and was subsequently imprisoned for 1 year. Later it was found out that the confession was false and he was not guilty of committing the crime. The reason they knew that is because someone else actually confessed to the crime. Guðjónsson and Mackeith wondered how such false confessions arise. There's a background study for this, Guðjónsson 1992, which suggested that there were 3 types of false confession: voluntary, coerced internalised, and coerced compliant. Voluntary, this is when a person freely confesses to a crime. Coerced internalised, this occurs when a suspect doesn't remember where they were when the crime was committed. From that point they can be led to believe that they did commit the crime, even when there is no evidence to suggest that they did commit the crime. This person internalises the idea that they committed the crime, and from that point they start to believe it until they confess. This can lead to false memories, which you may remember from your AS studies with the Loftus et al. 1974 study. The second type is coerced compliant. This occurs when a suspect is put under pressure, similar to Milgram's infamous experiment in 1963, such that they confess as the person conducting the interrogation wants them to. In order to qualify a person's susceptibility to giving false confessions, Guðjónsson created a scale called the Guðjónsson Suggestibility Scale, which attempted to measure both yield and shift. Yield refers to an individual's susceptibility to suggestive questioning. Shift refers to the suspect changing their answers as a result of the interrogation process and pressure. The scale is measured via a test. The test consists of a narrative paragraph which is read to the subject. Afterwards, the subject reports everything they can remember about the story. Later, the subject is questioned about the story. Some of the questions lead to false answers and some of them do not. After answering questions for the first time, the person being tested is told in a forceful manner that they have made a number of errors and must answer the questions for a second time. This leads the person to making even more errors than the first time. So if you're asked a question and you give an answer, even if it's right and someone forcefully tells you that it's wrong, the chances are that you're going to then change your mind. And we will find this out later in a study by Ash with majority influence. It's not the same thing where a forceful person tells you to do something wrong, but the majority says that something's right when it's in fact wrong. It leads to people believing that something is right when it's wrong. One of the problems with this scale, though, is that only approved people can view and use the scale, so we can't know exactly what it contains. The aim of the study was to document the case of the false confession of a youth who was at the time of the confession distressed and susceptible to interrogation pressure. Method and design: a case study of one 17-year-old boy. Participant was a 17-year-old boy accused of 2 murders. Throughout his case, his identity is protected and he's referred to FC. He was of slightly below average intelligence. His IQ was 94, with the average being 100. FC suffered from no mental illnesses and his personality was not obviously abnormal. Results: the alleged crimes he committed. In 1987, 2 elderly women were found battered to death in their homes. Both the women's savings were stolen and there was evidence of a sexual assault. A few days later, FC was arrested because he presented some inconsistencies in his account of his movements during an earlier routine inquiry and because he was spending more money than usual. All of which was highly circumstantial and does not prove outright that FC did in fact commit the crimes. There was also no forensic evidence to link him to the crime. After he was arrested, he was not allowed to access a solicitor and was interviewed at length by the police, leading to his confession. The next day, he repeated his confession in front of a solicitor. and later wrote a statement from jail which incriminated himself. After a year in jail, he was released by a court after another person pleaded guilty to the crime. Police interviews. FC's first interview lasted for nearly 14 hours with breaks. 5 officers questioned him. To start with, FC denied being near the scene, but after being repeatedly accused of lying, remember that this can cause people to change their mind, he agreed that he had been there. Many questions were leading and accusatory, and many suggested that he was sexually impotent, which he found very distressing. The following are examples of real dialogue from the case. Officer 1. Look, son, you've got the opportunity to tell your side of the story. Don't throw it away. I'm prepared to listen to you and help you where I can, but you have to start listening. You have to start talking and help yourself. Senior Detective. I can tell you truthfully, what these officers are telling you is right. I believe that you were there in the house that night and something went terribly wrong. Notice how this is similar to the Reed technique proposed by Imbauer et al. 1986. So you've got reinforced sincerity and you've got a direct statement saying that I believe you have committed the crime. So this can lead to a false confession, as we found in the Imbauer et al. Theory. In the second interview, the next day, in front of a duty solicitor, he retracted his statement, only to confess again under pressure about his failure to have successful relationships with women. After this, there were 3 further interviews. Psychiatric Examination. In prison, FC was examined by psychiatrists, and no evidence of mental illness was found, but he did score 10 for suggestibility on the Guðjónsson's Suggestibility Scale, making him abnormal in this respect. As mentioned before, his IQ was slightly below average at 94. From the Eisnick Personality Inventory, EPI, he was found to be a stable extrovert. Conclusions. This is a case of coerced compliant false confession, meaning that he gave in to pressure during the interviews in order to escape from an intolerable situation. It shows that this can happen to anyone and not just the mentally ill, mentally handicapped or illiterate. Following his release, FC appeared to undergo a change of personality. His experience hardened him and his self-confidence improved. Some evaluation points for Guðjónsson and Mackeith 1990. Now remember, this is not an exhaustive list. Ecological validity. As the study was a real case, we can say that it's high in ecological validity. Ethics, sort of high in ethics because FC's identity was hidden. Usefulness, this is actually quite a useful study because it allows us to see what we can do to prevent further false confessions and try and implement safeguards to protect those who may be susceptible to interrogation techniques. Of course, in the UK, interrogation techniques are illegal. It also shows a vulnerability in using confessions as evidence in criminal trials. Generalizability is a bit of a problem because it's a case study. There's only one person. It's hard to generalize this to more people. Reliability is quite high because of the use of the Guðjónsson Suggestibility Scale and IQ tests. Ethnocentrism and androcentrism, again, this is linked to generalizability because there's only one male. It's hard to generalize this to a wider population. Another strength is the construct validity. The results of the study show support for the Guðjónsson Suggestibility Scale and for the coerced compliant type of false confession.